Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the director of the John W. Kluge Center, Kevin Butterfield.
Good evening. Welcome to the Library of Congress. Our understanding of George Washington and King George III is clouded by myths that have accumulated for more than 2 centuries. This new exhibition that you're about to see, The Two Georges, Parallel Lives in an Age of Revolution, seeks to reveal the real men behind those myths. The exhibition is centered upon papers of George Washington here at the Library of Congress, the papers of Britain's King George III, which are at the Royal Archives in Windsor Castle. And these two Georges, while they never met during their lifetime, certainly knew about one another. And as commander of the Continental Army, Washington was largely responsible for one of the world-changing events that shaped King George III's reign, the loss of Britain's American colonies. King George is most famous here in the United States for exactly that moment. In the exhibit, you will see George Washington's own, I don't know if I'm supposed to say here's a spoiler for what you're about to see, but George Washington's own copy of the Declaration of Independence sent to him by John Hancock, and which he had read aloud to the troops in New York City on July 9th, 1776. It told the world that the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Of course, the history of King George III was more than just what people heard during the reading of that declaration that day. King George's reign spanned everything from the 7 Years' War, a war that George Washington, quite coincidentally, played a role in beginning, through the French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon. So too, George Washington was an integral part of virtually every important moment of the American founding across nearly a quarter century. Theirs was an age of revolutions and change. These were men who shaped their world. Tonight, we bring these two Georges together through their letters, ledgers, diaries, speeches, notes, drawings, and more. We can know these two men who did so much to shape the 18th century world in which they lived, thanks to stewards like the Library of Congress and the Royal Archives. We have an opportunity here in the 21st century, some many decades and centuries later, to capture that age of revolution in their own words. Their papers are supplemented with images, prints, books, scientific instruments, lent by other institutions, including Britain's Royal Collection, the Science Museum of London. Nearly every division of the Library of Congress is represented with books, prints, newspapers, manuscripts, music. All is organized around a single question: what do we really know about these two men? In some ways, we know quite a lot. These are two of the best documented lives of the 18th century. The library's George Washington collection exceeds 77,000 items that he preserved because he knew they would matter to the present, to the future, and items that we have preserved across the nation's history because we know they're important to understanding where we come from. So much of what we know has to be filtered, though, through deluges of images and anecdotes, myths and misperceptions that have almost overwhelmed our ability to know them as real people. The exhibition encourages you to go beyond those familiar stories and images, some cliched, some flat out wrong, and learn about the two Georges through their own writings and those of their contemporaries. You might even discover some surprising similarities. To guide us through the lives of these two men, I'd like to welcome the 14th Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, renowned biographer Flora Frazier, and the 24th Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Dee Dee Petri. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
And thank you, Kevin, for setting the stage for us and your introduction. And you can say this exhibition was 250 years in the making, but it did actually take 10 years from its initial idea to what we think is a wonderful exhibition that you will see. So before we delve into the conversation, I just want to thank the people who made the exhibit possible. And we can't give enough thanks to David Mandel and the talented staff of the library's exhibit department. David, would you please stand up? And also the people who really worked on that initial idea 10 years ago, Mr. Robert Newland, with the help of a former LOC colleague, Colleen Shogan, and Roberta Schaefer. And Colleen is here and Robert is here. Well, they should be. There's Roberta. Wow.
Oh, there they are. All right.
Yeah, they're here. They're here. There you go. And of course, our wonderful partners from, and I've been saying this all week, across the pond in the UK.
So good.
The Royal Library and Archives in Windsor and the Science Museum in London. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. So, we have Flora from across the pond and Dee Dee from just across town. And we have a healthy competition, I have to just say, with Mount Vernon over who has, and I see Kevin Butterfield, who was at Mount Vernon, saying this, who has more of George Washington? Well, I have to say that when it comes to his papers, it's the Library of Congress.
Okay. All right.
Just saying. And we have to also know that those instruments that you're going to see are from the Science Museum. So, ladies, let's spill some tea about these guys. Now, they were opposite in many ways, but they had more in common than we thought. How would you explain that, or what would you say about them?
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that George Washington is born in a time of monarchs and absolute power, and by the time he dies, he's essentially ushered in a whole new system, one of civilian rule, one of peaceful transfer of power, government by the people and for the people. I don't think that's something that George III could ever have imagined. So, to my mind, that's where they do very much diverge.
Yeah, and Dee Dee, I think that there is the difference, in a sense, as you see in this thought-provoking exhibition, is that George III was born, Prince George, a monarch in waiting, and as soon as he could walk and talk, he knew that, I guess, we don't know that. And even before he assumed the duties of monarch, this weighed on him. It might on a different man, woman, have weighed less, but this particular individual, the cares of being, as he conceived of it, father of the people, anointed by God, weighed on him in a really specific way. And that, of course, he never changed, whereas George Washington starts a colonial subject of George III and becomes something quite different, an American. Mm-hmm. And so I think that one doesn't change, and you could say is pretty obdurate about not changing, and the other is transformed.
Now, they weren't that far apart in age, right? When were they born?
1732 for George Washington.
And George III was born on the 4th of June, 1738. And all over, if you could imagine, in the governor's palaces, well, in Williamsburg, but in all the then colonies, the 4th of June was celebrated every year at the Court of St. James and in the governor's palace in all 13 colonies. It was the birthday ball. Well, of course, today, President's Day follows on from birthday balls which were instituted in February when George Washington becomes president. Mm-hmm. But I love the birthday ball being a sort of extraordinary symbol, and still, in fact, it is absolutely pointless information, but at Eton College, the 4th of June remains
Still.
thousands of years later their sort of speech day, sports day. Go figure.
And Dee Dee, you mentioned that the transformation, because they were both starting out, right? Products of the British Empire,
Well,
George
that's right.
Washington.
Absolutely, and I think George Washington quite clearly thought of himself as a subject of the king. I mean, he was an Englishman, and his early years, quite clearly, was working in advancing the work of the British Empire. He was a surveyor. He was helping to take account of land holdings and helping to expand the British Empire in that way. He certainly was working on behalf of Governor Dinwiddie. He sends him out into the Ohio country to take a look at the land and to talk to the French and try to get them away so that the English can take over that landscape. And then, as we heard earlier, I mean, we can thank George Washington in a way. When he was serving as an agent of the king, he starts the French and Indian War while he's out in the Ohio country. So in these respects, he was working on behalf of the king and the British Empire.
And then the king ascended, the prince, and so
Yes, so the kind of wrinkle about the Hanoverian succession, and they've only come, this dynasty, to the British throne in 1714, so they're new, they're still trying to establish themselves. The Stuarts are lurking, these exiled Stuarts on the continent, and so they're very keen on becoming English, and George III, when he accedes to the throne in 1760 at the age of 22, says, I'm proud, to be born a Briton. By the way, all quotations and all remarks and all ages that I give are approximate, not to mention completely erroneous. But I have so many friends in the audience who know better that the real dates are in either the companion volume or the exhibition. But he succeeds his grandfather, George II. So it goes George I, son George II. Then there's Frederick, Prince of Wales, George III's father, but he dies before his George II dies. So you get George I, George II, Frederick, bye-bye, poor Fred, and then you get George III. And those three are all, their mission is to expand the British Empire with colonies in the Caribbean, obviously here, the 13 colonies, and the empire builders are delving into parts of India. I mean, it's a big, it's an enormous global business. And George III tries to get hold of every part of it. It was the age of enlightenment, but also when the people of the time, whether it was Dr. Johnson making his dictionary or Diderot in Paris publishing the encyclopedia, they thought they could classify, they thought they could conquer all knowledge. We know with the internet today that we can't, but they thought they could. And George III sort of wore himself out trying to, and George Washington there, I would say, they are the same, or that they wanted to know everything.
wow.
I think that's right too. I mean, I love the fact that the exhibit shows that Washington was acquiring some instruments from the same place that King George was getting, I think, a telescope. So they both are fascinated by scientific advancements, particularly in the field of agriculture. And I love this exhibit because I think it helps us look at Washington and George III and their similar interests in agriculture. And that's something new and exciting to see, that they really were on the same wavelength when it came to that.
And reading some of the same books.
Reading some of the same books.
So for us,
And
that
I
was...
find it so interesting that even after he vanquishes the British and defeats them, he's always an Anglophile. He always loves Batty Langley, his landscape. This is a landscape that is a British landscape. He wants to have British things. He engages in correspondence with Arthur Young. So you would think that perhaps he'd become a Francophile, but he never really does, although obviously he loves Lafayette, but he really is always an Anglophile.
And what's interesting and what we found was that they were similar in that they were homebodies, if you could be a homebody in a castle or on the mansion on the Potomac, but they had what you would call the seemingly middle-class values of accountability and restraint and modesty. And then they both lost their fathers at an early age, and they were raised by single mothers who were pretty strong. Could you just touch on that a little bit, the strong moms?
So, poor Fred, as he was known, Frederick, Prince of Wales, dies, leaving, or rather writing to young Prince George before he dies, a sort of letter of instruction on how to be a good king. And because George III, even as a youth, was dutiful, painstaking, he really tries to be this patriot king. But his mother becomes really, she's in a regency council, and anyone who's a regent in Britain, in any regency, is always, comes in for the flack. And so Augusta, she's there was a wonderful show at the Yale Centre for British Art, Enlightened Princesses. She's a princess of the Enlightenment, along with her mother-in-law. But she hasn't got that much time because she's got 9 children to look after and to educate, and she gives over Prince George, now the Prince of Wales, into the hands of this Scottish nobleman, Lord Bute. And it's a huge success because this slightly slow boy sort of overcomes, with the aid of Bute, this sort of slowness of mind, and he kind of wakes up. I mean, whether good or not, Bute sort of puts fire in his belly. But until George III accedes to the throne, age 22, Bute's unpopular because he's a Scot, and these Highlanders are vermin in the eyes of the English. And so he's growing up in an unfortunate, confrontational situation with his grandfather, the king. And I think that's why he really settles down to live as domestically, parsimoniously, and in all senses of the word, away domestically and away from the court, bare the minimum. Because with the bride he takes, Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Mecklenburg-Strelitz is a pocket handkerchief principality in Germany, but actually she is, again, a wonderfully educated, curious woman of the Enlightenment, and he is happy. Mr. King is happy with Mrs. King, and it's how he relaxes Queen Charlotte, the children, until the boys get obstreperous, and music. And I think it's the cares of the world, he can forget them in those domestic moments.
Yeah, and I think that's very much the same for George Washington. I mean, he loved Mount Vernon, and he referred to it as the most pleasantly situated estate in all of America. And I think there was just something about it that helped him to relax. And even in his most difficult times, right before battles or in the bleakest days, he's writing home to the farm manager. How are we doing on the seeds? Have we planted the tree? Are we getting the native plants out of the woodlands to bring them in? There was just something about Mount Vernon and in his home and being a homebody that really relaxed him and I think helped him. Now, of course, it's interesting. It is a big house, but when Queen Elizabeth II, I'm told on good authority, came to visit us, she referred to it as a very nice cottage. So it is true, it did expand over the years, and in fact, he inherited it from his father and then from his stepfather. And you all must come to Mount Vernon and see it because it's now in the midst of the largest restoration we've had since the ladies took over the estate in 1853. But it was a place that he enjoyed tinkering with and working on, and how ironic that Mount Vernon is named after Admiral Edward Vernon, a British admiral for whom Lawrence Washington served. So all sorts of little things there. And then that leads me to say that we can go back to his mother,
Right.
because she was a very strong woman. She was deemed a termagant by many, and I suspect that's probably not too far from the truth. But she was insistent that George Washington was not going to join the Royal Navy. So thank heavens for that, because that might have changed the course of history if he had otherwise done what she did not want him to do.
And you said she was characterized as being a little too strong at
Well, I
the
think
time?
she was a very strong woman. Obviously, she had a large family. Her husband died early. She had to bring all of them up. She was running the farm on her own. I think she was a very strong woman. I think she had strong opinions. I doubt that she had much of a sense of humor. And so you begin to see some where the characteristics of George Washington come from as well.
From his mom.
So,
Well, let's get into then the wives, more strong women. You mentioned Charlotte, and
Yes.
tell us about Charlotte, because there are some popular culture things going on about Charlotte.
Yeah. So when I was presenting my last book, a book about the life of Scottish Jacobite heroine Flora MacDonald, I would say, now has anyone here read or watched Outlander? Well, I think with Queen Charlotte, it's so Bridgerton, and for those who don't know about Bridgerton, it's a wildly successful and fun and counterfactual TV series in which Queen Charlotte is a beautiful black princess who, and then she marries George III, and she then embraces people of color at court, and it's called the Grand Experiment, or the Great Experiment of these two different races coming together. Well, anyway, it's huge fun and glorious to watch. But there is this much truth in it. No. It's not just a smidgen or nothing. There is a 13th century Moorish mistress or wife, possibly, of a Portuguese king, Alfonso, and from whom Queen Charlotte and her Mecklenburg family descend, as do many of other members of the European royal families at that time, this time. And Moorish, just to explain, at that time, in the 18th century, if you refer to someone Moorish in Spain or Portugal, you mean someone who is not Spanish. Spanish indigenous, they can be native, but I suppose you just say non-white. It doesn't say what, you can't say whether that's sub-Saharan, Berber, Moroccan. So Moorish and Muslim. And so that's going back to the 13th century, actually much more interesting as celebrated, if slightly maverick, genealogist in England, Sir Ian Moncrieff of that ilk, pointed out shortly after the late Queen was crowned, George III, and so his descendants, the late Queen, the current King, all the royal British Hanoverian royal family, are descended from a Moorish Muslim wife, definitely a wife, of a king of Castile, a Spanish king, also called Alfonso, different century, but that's really the black blood in this British royal family.
I'm not going to touch that.
But the two things, that there is a portrait of Queen Charlotte, in which she looks, if you like, African. It's a profile, and the King and Queen gave it to St. John's College, Oxford, when they visited on one of their royal progresses, and she's it's by Anne Ramsay, who provided the great companion state portraits for every governor's palace, and no one, when Queen Charlotte arrived as the King's bride in 1761 in London, said, anything about her race. They said she's plug ugly. That was the response of, I think she's very elegant, but it was much later, when she'd had 15 children in 20 years and she was dropsical and near the end of her life, that a German physician, not hers, says, really rather spitefully, given that she's shortly to die, he says, the old Queen has the true mulatto features. I mean, there was maybe so, but the only other interesting remark that's made when this young Queen arrives from Germany is Horace Walpole, who's quite a keen observer, says she has her nostrils, or her nose is too broad, and so is her mouth, and she's also too pale. So it's a wonderful maelstrom.
I don't have anything quite so exotic about Martha.
Martha.
I mean,
However, there is still that exhibit at Mount Vernon where she's in front of the fireplace and she's destroying the letters.
I
And
know.
archivists and librarians all over the world, when they see that, it's like, stop, Martha,
isn't
stop.
that the truth? And we do have the papers of Martha Washington at the George Washington Library, and that does give us insight to a very lively correspondent who communicated with her family members and friends. So we do have that, but I think far less exciting. One thing that I think is interesting is that we do know she went to winter camp with George Washington, and in fact they've documented that she spent almost half the time that he was away, 1775 to 1783, with him in camp, which I think is really rather amazing. And she was instrumental, I think, in sort of keeping the morale up at camp. She served as a secretary and a close confidant, so she was very much engaged, I think, in that. I love to say, since I'm here in Thomas Jefferson's house, that there were 2 days that Martha Washington hated the most. One was when her husband died, and the second was when Thomas Jefferson came to call. So,
Yeah, there was a little something there. A little something there. But, you know, it's, well, then, if you have, what about their relationships with their children? Martha's children, the 15.
well, Martha certainly
yeah.
didn't have, Martha and George certainly did not have 15. They cannot keep up with that. They never had any children. There's some speculation that when Washington went to Barbados, he was rendered sterile. They obviously did have two children, Patsy and Jackie, who were Martha's children by Daniel Parke Custis. And George was very close to them, helped raise the children and then grandchildren with Martha. I think there's some great stories about his frustration with Jackie, who was a wastrel, I think in many senses of the word. But I think there's every indication of a very warm and affectionate relationship where the two of them were strongly involved in the lives of their stepchildren and grandchildren.
And the grandchildren, too, he kept up. What about those
I thought-
15?
Sorry?
15 children.
15 children, and one man midwife, or I suppose obstetrician, delivered all of those 15. We don't know, I mean, just we're going to go into it, whether there were any miscarriages, but all of 15 children in 20 years. And that was 9 sons and 6 daughters. And with Queen Charlotte, this extraordinary and just as robust, this an absolutely essential headmistress of this establishment, Lady Charlotte Finch, was governess to all 15 children for those 20 years, having her own children to look after, etc. And it was like first a junior school, then a sort of junior and senior school, and then a junior and senior and school and university. And it was a really, in the Royal Archives and in the Georgian papers that you can read online, you can see that this is elite education, but it's really just as interesting. Queen Charlotte both sits in on her son's lessons because, like, you know, she wants to keep learning, you know, and she has her son's tutors give lessons to her daughters, and it's a really interesting kind of model, or what else you do, but you get an extraordinary sense of how this petite woman mastered the art of administering this. I mean, every one of the sons had about 6 tutors, governors, drawing masters, mathematical masters, and I'm afraid that the Prince of Wales, who later became George IV and was Queen Charlotte's idol, she adored him, and they had the same sensibility. They had fantastic taste, and if only the wastrel Prince of Wales, Prince Regent George IV had become an interior decorator, then someone would have paid him rather than him not paying any bill for all of his many mansions.
Oh, we are getting the tea.
And if I could add too, is when we look at Martha Washington, there's been some questioning, how tall was she? How little was she? And so we've been doing some really interesting research at Mount Vernon where we take the fragments of some of her clothing and have been able to analyze that she probably was around 5 inches, 5 feet 2 inches.
That's
and of course,
tall.
obviously, whenever she's compared against George, she looked very tiny, but we think she was probably about 5 inches, 5 feet 2 inches. Speculation that she might have been a 12 petite. She had certain styles that she particularly liked, and what we're also realizing is she was just a magnificent seamstress. We're engaged in a project right now of restoring some tops to quilts that she has. We will have them on display within the next few months at Mount Vernon, but she did incredible stitching and fancy cutting, and so she was really very, very talented in that regard as well. And so we're beginning to see some added dimensions of Martha
to
Washington.
Martha's thing. And did she burn the letters?
She did indeed burn the letters. There were a few that were little fragments that we have, but we have to speculate what might have been said between the two of them.
Well, they wanted to keep it private. Very few things there were. Now, you both mentioned the interest in agriculture. How do you think that helped them, if any way, with their leadership and just how they maintain themselves?
Well, they both read the same, as Dee Dee said, they read the same agricultural manuals, the same agricultural magazines, and in fact, George, who was known in the country as Farmer George, he was so obsessed with agricultural reform, and but it wasn't, I mean, yes, of course, he was interested as someone interested in science and experiment, but it was because not only the United Kingdom, but after the loss of America, the Caribbean colonies, the British Caribbean colonies, they're all very small spaces, and crops which waste the land, which draw out the nutrients, used to mean that you had to move on. And this is, it's sort of, even though Washington quite rightly, did these calculations, but he did have a lot of America to move into, whereas in England you didn't. And these amazing sort of agronomists, if you like, including a peer, the Lord Townshend, who was known as Turnip Townshend because he devised a form of crop rotation. This was all very much part of making the British Empire more productive, or making sure it didn't get less productive.
And George?
And I think this is such a fascinating area where they are very, very similar. And there's a book by Bruce Ragsdale, who is a Georgian Fellow at the George Washington Library, where he looks at George Washington and the plow and really points out that the land was so critical to really developing the American Republic, and having rich, productive agriculture was something that Washington foresaw would be critical for our nation. He wanted us to be a granary to the nation. And so he is fascinated by this, and I think we don't give him the credit he is due in terms of being a real conservationist. And when you come out to Mount Vernon, you can see his 16-sided barn, something that he himself devised. You can see his regular experimentation in terms of how to enrich the soil. He was always looking to see what kind of manure, animal manure, or should we use mud from the river, or gypsum, and he's always experimenting there to see what works best. And as you've said, he was very interested in crop rotation, because early on he realized that tobacco, which was such an essential part of so many 18th century Virginia and other southern farmers, he was not going to stick with tobacco, that it was ruinous to the soil. And so he moves into grains, corn and wheat. And I think this just shows a much more imaginative side of George Washington that we don't always think of in terms of his work. And I've got to mention one other feature when you come to Mount Vernon. You must see the dung repository. He was our first composter. He was taking refuse from throughout the farm. And there is even a a pipe from the house, because there's quite a bit of water, and he drains that water down into the dung repository, so that he knew early on that if you're going to have good compost, you've got to have moisture. So he was really ahead of things. We think of Jefferson and others as these innovators, but he was innovating quite a bit when it comes to his farm and the way he's thinking about agriculture and enriching the soil and advancing America's riches.
Jefferson just turned his head there a little bit.
I couldn't resist.
I know.
I couldn't resist.
Couldn't do it. Well, before we, and I have to ask you this, and we'll go, and I hope that when you look at the exhibit that you all will see some of the things that Dee Dee and Flora mentioned and some other things that are really going to stick out. They never met during their lifetimes, but just speculate if they had. Do you think they would have, what would they have thought of each other?
I mean, I think that obviously they thought about each other as, you know, these commanders-in-chief facing off against each other for 8 years of war, and as we've said, Washington, the king knew when he was Prince of Wales, oddly enough, about Major Washington up in the Ohio lands, because George, there was a letter printed, and the young, I think this is right, the young George Washington up in the Ohio lands sort of writes to his brother and says, "Oh, I heard bullets whistle." It was absolutely charming listening to all these bullets whistling around, and apparently the young Prince of Wales comments rather tartly, "Well, I think he might not think that if it had a few more bullets, you know, zooming around him." George III, of course, never went to war of any kind himself. But it's, I think, where you really see George III's opinion of Washington is, you first have this story, which may be true, that the American painter who was actually who was George III's favorite painter in London, Benjamin West, he was painting George III as the end of the war was coming, and George III says, "Oh, and what do you think General Washington or Mr. Washington will do?" And Benjamin says, "Oh, he's going to retire back into private life at Mount Vernon." And the king says, "Oh, if he does that, he will be the greatest man that ever lived." So that's a wonderful story. But I think really where you see George III's respect for Washington, I think which he had pretty early on in the war, obviously, is when John Adams comes as the first American minister to the court of St. James, and the king says, "I was the last to consent or to wish for a separation, but now that a separation has been effected, I am the first to welcome in friendship the United States." And I think a large part of that is that George Washington is you know, the president. I mean, everyone knows he's going to be the president, and I think that's to me, in a sense, where you get George III, the king's respect for the president and also for America as a result.
Good. And what do you think?
Yeah, I think that they would have gotten along very well. I think they would have talked a lot about agriculture. I think that would have been immensely fun. I think George Washington would have really admired the library, the books, the education, something that he never had. He always felt, I think, inferior, that unlike his older brothers, Lawrence, and the other brothers who got to go to school in England, he never could. So I think he would have definitely admired that. Washington always said he wanted to go to London. Obviously, he didn't get there, but I think they would have had a wonderful conversation there on the piazza overlooking the Potomac.
And I think Queen Charlotte and Martha would have been absolute soul sisters. I mean, Martha was an absolute, a fashion queen, as was Queen Charlotte. And they were, even when Martha, I think this is right, is at the new Republican court having, drawing rooms, and what she wears is, obviously she's by then of an age, but she's always of the best. And Queen Charlotte, I mean, there was nothing like, Queen Charlotte and the King, because of this domestic life, they'd go into the shops in Windsor, and no king had done that before in the UK, and it certainly wasn't happening over at Versailles. I mean, before a certain unfortunate.
Well, in the exhibit, spoiler alert, there is a shopping list of George Washington's, to what goods to buy in Great Britain too. So there was that exchange. Well, thank you both, because you've given us some real insight, and it will help in terms of looking at the papers and the instruments, and that really speaks to the value of preserving those items. And we're just pleased that the items that you will see about instruments are the actual instruments of George III, and they are in the careful care. And that's why we think he's here, to make sure they were installed correctly. Our dear friend, who is the director of the Science Museum in London, Sir Ian Blanchard, to close us out.
Well, good evening, everyone. And I have a big problem, and it's all Flora's fault. Because, to use the language that young people in Britain and America love, she has really triggered me. Because she mentioned Bridgerton. The reason I say that is because I'm told that when Bridgerton started, I, being a very kind of historically minded person, would spend each episode shouting at the television. And then something really extraordinary happened. So Adjoa Andal, who's one of the lead actresses in the series, came to a lunch at the Science Museum, and she said, "Come with me, honey." And she took me to see the filming. No, I bet you haven't done that, Flora. But I have to say, and I was torn between disdain and deep love. It is such a great series. So anyway, I've recovered from that, but I will have words with you later, Flora, for sending me off on a tangent. But look, it's a great pleasure to be here. And first of all, I'm just soaking in the atmosphere, because the whole point of this building was to awe and impress the Europeans. And you know, Carla, it works. It really works. I don't know if this is a library or a palace or an opera house, and it's all of those things. But I wanted to start by explaining a bit about the origins of the project, because back in 2015, Queen Elizabeth II announced a radical contribution to scholarship, permission to commence the complete digitization of the archives of King George III. This was of instant interest to the Science Museum, because our galleries display the extraordinary private scientific instrument collections enjoyed by the King and his children, whilst the King's notes and records are in the Royal Archives. This wonderful project had many partners, including our colleagues at the Library of Congress, and that's how I came to meet Dr. Hayden. And she deserves the full credit for floating the idea of an exhibition exploring the parallel lives of two great men in partnership with the British institution. Now, in the conventional world, we would have sealed the deal in a business meeting, but in our case, it was rather stylish. Carla and I were invited to Buckingham Palace by Her Majesty's Private Secretary, Sir Christopher Geidt. And over a delicious lunch, Carla outlined her idea, I responded, and Christopher's marriage deal was secure by the time the strawberries and cream arrived. And since then, our teams have enjoyed a joint exploration of the collections and ideas, undeterred by the Atlantic or by the pandemic. And the resulting exhibition reveals so much more about the President and King, well beyond the familiar, as I think we've already heard. And of course, the immediate image of King George is that of a frail old man trapped by mental decline, but that is just a tiny fragment of his story. In his youth, he was a thoughtful ruler and energetic in the pursuit of many interests, one of which was natural philosophy, the term then used to describe what we know today as science. As young as 22, upon ascending the throne in 1760, the king was assembling a personal collection of scientific instruments of absolutely the finest quality. The Science Museum cares for these stunning items on behalf of King's College London. And both institutions are thrilled to be lending some of these remarkable objects to the Library of Congress, and look forward to them being returned eventually. Dr. Hayden, just so we're clear. But let me just give you two examples of why those objects are extraordinary. One is King George's Surveyor's Compass, showing his keen interest in surveying and understanding the land. And as we've just heard, likewise, we see in the exhibition that George Washington, even as a teenager, was making surveying notes and drawings in his copybook ahead of becoming a professional surveyor, trying to make sense of the landscape as a young man before embarking, I think, on one of the greatest feats of imagination of all time, the audacity to shape the geography and values of America itself. I think Dee and I agree on that. You will also see the armillary sphere, an intricate mechanical model of the universe made in 1731 by the London instrument maker Jonathan Sisson for King George III's father, Prince Frederick. And George Washington recorded his own fascination with the orrery he visited at Harvard, describing it, and I quote, as a curious piece of mechanism for showing the revolutions of the sun, earth, and other planets. I also want to intrigue you, if I may, by mentioning the King's Laboratory Bench, which isn't in the exhibition, but is on display in the Science Museum. Sadly, it's just too large to travel. It's important to know that it is called a philosophical table, and it is the only known surviving example of its kind anywhere in the world. It truly encapsulates an Enlightenment view of knowledge. The two Georges, and I think this is what fascinates me about both of them, did not divide the world into art and science, as we so often and too often do in our contemporary society. They valued ideas and innovations wherever rational thought revealed the beauty of nature. And if that wasn't tempting enough for a trip to London, I would like to invite you to visit the Science Museum in 2026, when we open our version of this exhibition, a brilliant companion to what you are seeing today. Our exhibition will expand on the scientific stories to show how science shaped America 250 years ago. It will be our moment in London to mark 250 years of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We're over it, okay? And a moment to showcase not only the wonderful partnership between the Science Museum Group and the Library of Congress, because the folks here are really awesome and wonderful colleagues, but also, of course, the really special bond between our two democracies. Now, whilst the project is grounded in impeccable scholarship, I can't resist doing what the panel has already done, which is hoping that the visitors will speculate about the relationships that never happened in real life. And of course, I really want to imagine the two Georges gazing across the Potomac River, or even better, the thing I really long could have happened, Martha and Charlotte taking tea in the splendid green dining room at Mount Vernon. And can I just say to you, Dee Dee, that I love Mount Vernon. It is, for an Englishman, it feels like home. It's really weird, but I love that place. And finally, because I've now seen the exhibition so much, what's so obvious to me is the intelligence of the exhibition, the many layers that it gives you are really extraordinary. And for me, it's a clever blend of the intimate and the momentous. And there are precious documents that will really send a shiver down your spine. Or a particular quotation, which you can imagine sent me slightly reeling. King George writing to his Prime Minister in 1774, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." That's quite a quote. But I think, above all, what I love about this exhibition, it achieves something you always hope with a really great show. It's not only a time machine, but it's a great beacon for understanding. And I salute our colleagues here for achieving something really beautiful. Thank you.